everyone. I want to welcome you to the ITS webcast for the Windows 7 migration using Altiris 7.1. So what I wanted to cover today was migrating from Windows XP to Windows 7 using the deployment solution. That's the most common migration scenario. We've also used deployment solution to migrate from Windows 95 to Windows 7. We used PC Transplant for that, and that worked fairly well. So there's a lot of migration options today. I'm going to talk about a lot of the concepts that are involved in doing these migrations and how to automate them. It doesn't have to be specific to Windows XP or specific to Windows 7 because a lot of the concepts will stay the same. I don't have a PowerPoint prepared because I'm keeping this to a technical demonstration of all the DS concepts and what you do in real-world situations of getting your organization to Windows 7 in an automated manner. So what I'd like to start with is the console. This is the Jobs and Tasks menu in the DS. One thing I should mention is this is running on the latest beta of DS, which is due out fairly soon, later this quarter. And the reason why I'm using this beta is because they've added some extra functionality to the deployment solution that can help you with that migration process. For anyone that's on the deployment solution 6.9 or even 6.8, it's kind of night and day, the differences between the two. 6.8 and 6.9 used a Win32 console. With 7.1, everything's baked in to the web console, so you have one system to manage your machines, whether it's delivering software, imaging, inventory. It's all in one place. One of the challenges people had before coming from DS 6.9 would be to how to layer on software, how to install software after the imaging process. Because as you know, imaging is really just a step in a migration or a provisioning process for your machines. Doing it in DS 7.1 allows you to have all of your tasks and your process all in one place, so you're not jumping back and forth between systems, and you're not having to do a lot of integration between the two systems. So having it all in one place is a great feature, and it's a great reason to go to DS 7.1. So some of the concepts in DS 7, we have our jobs and tasks, which basically control what the machines are doing. We also have our PXE settings and driver settings. I want to walk through some of those first because our jobs and tasks depend on having these settings and having these configurations created. So it'd be good to understand how this environment's set up before we jump into the migration. The first piece we have up here is the driver database management. This does a couple of things. The first thing it does is it allows you to manage your drivers and deploy anywhere. So when you're migrating from Windows XP to Windows 7, sometimes you're using the same hardware, sometimes it's different hardware. Regardless, you want to make sure you have the appropriate drivers ready for Windows 7, especially if you're going to 64-bit. And the way you do that is you gather up your drivers. I like using an application called WinDriver Ghost. It's a shareware, but you can also license it for your enterprise. It's very low cost, and that allows you to pick up your drivers and add them to deploy anywhere. And actually, I'll show you what that looks like so you can get an idea of how easy that is. So I'm going to run WinDriver Ghost here. And if you do a fast collect, it's going to show you all the unique drivers, basically the non-Microsoft ones, the ones that did not come with the operating system. So you can see my VMware tools, had some drivers in here, along with mass storage driver. So if I wanted to copy that, I would just do a make, and it basically just stores it to a drivers folder for me. You copy that drivers folder up to your server, or you can access it through the web browser. And then you choose Add, and you pick your folder where your drivers are stored. For me, I stored them in the NSCAP folder, but you can put them anywhere. And it's not going to show you any files in here because it's just looking for the folder with the files. You can see down here it's loading the drivers, and if you click Add, it will add the drivers to the database. So you can see it failed because I've already added these drivers. So it's actually aware of what drivers you have in there, what operating system it's applicable to, and what platform. So if it's 32-bit, 64-bit, etc. You can search through these. So this is nice to see, if you already have drivers. So if I search for Intel, you'll be able to see, all these different network drivers and what OSs they apply to. You can also look at more information and look at the exact device ID. Anytime you're doing any kind of imaging, whether it's bare metal imaging or if you're doing a migration to Windows 7, you're going to be missing drivers on some of your hardware models. So one of the things I like to do is go into the device manager, look up your device ID, and see if you already have that driver loaded. And this will tell you, exactly which devices it's matching up to. So this is just one tab of the driver database management. The other tab is the preboot tab. This manages all of your drivers for your boot disks, whether it's WinPE or Linux. This version of deployment solution, the latest beta, actually uses WinPE 3.1. The current release version of DS uses WinPE 2.1. In general, the drivers are fairly similar. 2.1 is basically your equivalent to Vista SP1, while 3.1 is the equivalent to Windows 7 SP1. If you're migrating a large number of machines, you can use image multicasting, which basically has the server do a unicast stream down to one client, and it picks the client based on the fastest of the group, and that one becomes the master. It can then multicast the image out to the other machines, and you can set the number of clients for the threshold to automatically activate multicasting. So by default, it's going to do anything more than 10 clients. If I send an imaging job down to, it will just send the image stream down to one, and then that one will multicast out to the others. And this does work with Ghost. Preboot configurations is where we manage our boot disks. I have one set up for Pixie, and I have one set up for the automation folder. Pixie, it's basically nothing really has changed there. You have your Pixie servers in your environment, strategically placed, and your boot disks are automatically uploaded to there. The automation folder is new to DS 7.1. In DS 6, they called it the automation partition. So rather than installing a separate partition on every machine, because sometimes there are compatibility issues with that, it now sets up a folder, and then it just manipulates the like the boot order of that machine to look at a specific folder to boot from. So there's fewer compatibility issues in doing it that way. It's a much better way of doing it, especially with Windows 7. So with that said, I'm going to go back to our jobs and tasks, and we're going to walk through a couple different pieces of how you would set up your migration jobs. The first thing you want to do is capture your Windows 7 image that you'd be migrating to. With anything in deployment, there's always going to be at least 50 different ways of doing the same thing. So it really depends on what you're accomplishing and how customized your process is. The processes I'll be showing you today are very vanilla, very straightforward. So that doesn't mean it's the only way of doing it. It just means it's kind of the easiest. Every organization has different requirements. Some have complex computer naming schemes. Some require them to be joined to different OUs, based on different criteria. All of that can be scripted in, and you can add logic to this deployment process so that you have more flexibility on how you're imaging your machines. So the first task we have here is sysprepping the Windows 7 machine. In Altiris DS 7.1, they call it Prepare for Image Capture. I renamed it to sysprep just because that makes more sense to me. I tell it what version of OS it is, and I told it to use the current product key. For it to rejoin the domain, if you want to reuse that machine after you've sysprepped it, you can tell it to rejoin the domain, and it'll basically restore, put it back in the same OU, put it back in the same domain using these credentials. Important difference in from DS6 to DS7 is how you boot into Pixie and how you boot into your automation. In DS7, that reboot task is built into the sysprep task. So you can see, right below the sysprep configuration, we have our reboot command, and we're telling it to boot into automation, which is essentially using our automation folder on that machine. If you wanted to boot into Pixie, you just choose your Pixie disk here and choose your architecture. The next task I have is to run Ghost to capture that image. You give it an image name. It will span the image as appropriate. If you want it, split up into like 2 GB chunks. You specify your imaging tool, Ghost or Rapid Deploy. A common question we get for going to Windows 7 is, can we reuse our existing WIMs? Because you may already have WIMs of Windows 7 images, and you absolutely can. It's just not an option in that drop-down box. So the way you would do it is just call the image X from a command line as a run script from within Windows PE. So whatever command line you're using today should work the same. You may have to specify a path to your local site server, which can be done through environment tokens or environmental variables that are built into that boot disk. Under Advanced, we have options of how to split up that file. By default, it'll put everything into one file. If you need to add extra command lines, you can do that here. So for instance, if you wanted to change the compression level of Ghost of how you're capturing your image, I could change that to a Z1 or Z2, and that would affect the compression level. Some environments, you'll want to upload the image over HTTP in case SMB is not available in your networking environment, and you can do that by specifying the URL here and the credentials to connect to the IIS server. Normally SMB is acceptable though. This is an important concept to understand in DS7, disk image versus backup image. Basically, disk image is your sysprepped version of your image. Backup image is your non-sysprep version. Altiris will treat these differently because when you capture a disk image, by default, that image will get replicated to all of your package servers. So when you're doing imaging across your sites, that'll automatically come down to your package servers. In DS6, you didn't really have any kind of built-in replication like that. A lot of people created their own scripts, either using Robocopy or DFS to synchronize those images and those driver packages. In DS7, it's leveraging the built-in package infrastructure, and so you don't have to set up any custom scripts like that. It just does it for you, which is a great feature of leveraging that platform. If you're capturing just a backup image, which again is the non-sysprep version, that will only store the image at that local site server, because the idea is that you would only be restoring that image to the same machine where it came from. You wouldn't really be distributing it elsewhere. So that package would not get replicated outside of that site server. One other common question we get is for people who are capturing sysprep images, they may not want all the images going to all the package servers, which is the default. So I'm going to show you how to change that real quick. So we're going to go back into our settings, back into deployment. For every image you capture, it shows up under disk images. From here, you can manage it just like any other package. And you can specify which package server for it to go to. So you can see by default, it's going to go to all package servers. And you can also see where the image is stored. So if you ever need to manipulate that Ghost file directly, you can just go into that folder. The command here to boot to production basically tells it after it's done running through that image capture, boot back into the local hard drive and out of Pixie or out of your automation folder. In DS6, every task you had as part of a job, you would tell it which boot disk to be in, whether it was production or a Pixie disk or whatever. In DS7, it's not on a per task basis. Rather, you tell it explicitly within that job of where it should be booted to. So it's very, very sequential. So the first reboot command is coming as part of the sysprep task, and then it's going to stay inside WinPE until you tell it otherwise. So at the very end, we're telling it to exit out of WinPE and then boot back into production. If we didn't have that task there, it would stay in WinPE. We're going to run through and show you what that capture job looks like from the client side. So I'm going to go to dual screens here, and I'm going to run this on our Windows 7 machine. So just like any other task in Altiris 7.1, you can do a quick run, or you can schedule it to run at a later time. When you do this new schedule, you have the option of choosing a group of machines. So if you have an organizational group or a target you want to use, that's where you specify that. So that's useful if you want to migrate machines en masse. And of course, just like with any other job, you can track the progress of the individual tasks. So you can drill down into each level here, and you can see that the agent is getting ready to start the sysprep process here. So if I were to go into this agent, you could probably see this running already. Migration job, as I mentioned, I wanted to keep it simple. So the first thing we do is capture the personality using PC Transplant. PC Transplant's been around for a long time. If you've used DS 6.9 or 6.8 or even 6.5, you'll remember it from then. We're using a token here, so we're storing the name of the package we're creating based on the computer name. This works well if you're keeping the same computer name. If you're changing computer names, then you'll want to have some sort of mapping between the old name and the new name. There's a lot of different ways of doing that. Some people will create like a separate SQL table, so they store like the old name with the new name, and then you can just run a SQL query as part of a script that will, or a token even, that would pull in that new name, so that way you know what file it should be stored as. The second piece of this is setting up your templates. I'll quickly bring up the PC Transplant template so you can see some of the options of how you're going to back up your personality. So PC Transplant calls it a personality. Really what it is it's a copy of certain data from your profile. So we're going to run template.exe, and this template is a template builder, which will allow us to define which data we want to bring over. This is one of the most important pieces of the migration process, because your end user base may have different expectations as to what data you're bringing over and what data you're not bringing over. So communicating this effectively before the migration is very critical, so that people will understand what you're bringing over and there aren't any hurt feelings if you don't bring over all their APIs of their cat videos that they took last weekend. So there's a lot of predefined templates. I created one from scratch called Win7 Migration. This is where you specify which users to bring over. By default, everything is checked in here. I usually go with more of a minimalist approach, where I'll uncheck everything and only choose the things you really want to bring over, because they may not want their wallpaper from 4 years ago. But there's everything in here from wallpapers, screensaver, printers, etc. There's also some network settings. It's rare that I see an actual use case of where you want to bring over some of these network settings, because typically you're defining those as part of sysprep. So applications is where different applications, basically these are the ones that are built into the template editor. And so if you want to bring over like Internet Explorer favorites and cookies, Outlook accounts, you can do all that from here, and these are all built in. Over time, this template builder gets updated with new templates. And so, for instance, the latest version of PC Transplant supports Office 2010. So you can do things like Office 2003 to Office 2010 because that's a native feature of PC Transplant. You can go from Internet Explorer 6 to Internet Explorer 8. All of that is supported going from one version to another. For some of you that may have used USMT, which is the Microsoft User State Migration tool, that's also another tool that's available that will allow you to move user profiles over. But it's mostly editing an XML file and can be kind of tricky to customize what data you want. So in the past, I've used USMT to migrate a whole profile over if I want to bring over absolutely everything. But if I just want to pick and choose different files or different app settings, then PC Transplant's my go-to tool for doing that. If you have in-house applications or applications that aren't listed on here that you like to back up, you have a couple of options. One is you can build your own template for that application. So if you know exactly what registry keys you have and exactly which files are stored as part of the application, you can build a template in here, and so it'll show up in this list just like all these others. As a best practice, we normally don't check that, manage the installation of applications. That's something that you'll want to do through either a software delivery policy or as part of your jobs and tasks. The next piece is defining specific files, folders, and file types to bring over as part of that personality package that may not be part of an application template. So you can add specific files. You can also filter out certain files. By default, a lot of system files are already filtered out for you. You can also filter out different folders and drives. So you can see by default, it's not going to back up your World of Warcraft DVD and any USB drives you have plugged in. For folders, typically some of these are checked. So if you want to bring over the user's desktop, you can do that from here. Bring over their My Documents. It will look in, for every user you're backing up, it will look at their folders, depending on which ones you have checked. You can also add your own. And if you were to choose something and, let's say like users, let's say like all users, let's say like application data, and you want to include the subfolders, it typically makes that into a variable. So that way it'll translate across Windows XP to Windows 7. File types is very useful. This allows you to add certain file extensions, and it will search the entire local drive for those file extensions, and it'll bring over any files that it matches. So that's useful if it's kind of a safety net or a catch-all. So if you know you absolutely need to bring over Excel documents, and everyone is supposed to be storing them in a specific folder you're backing up, but sometimes Excel documents move around, linger. The user says they're not they're keeping everything in that folder, but there's a chance they may not actually be in there. Then this can automatically search the drive for any file extension you tell it. You can also add your own file extensions through this too. This does lengthen the backup process because it does have to search for all those file extensions that you add here. So normally you can leave this the default because the server is going to be telling it where to store that package. File compression is enabled by default. You have some options around replacing files. There's some also more advanced options around an undo option. By default, it'll create a shortcut on their desktop, which will basically allow them to undo the migration and roll back all those changes. But you can turn that off if you want. This is important, saving this template file so you don't have to go through these settings again. You can have as many templates as you want. So you may have a template for like the marketing department because you know that they're storing files in a certain space, or that they have certain application settings they want to bring over. But that department may be different than the accounting department where they want to have lots of access databases backed up. So you have as many templates as you want to kind of customize or personalize your migration experience. So then after we save that file, you then select the template here under the Browse, and that will upload it to the server. So that way when this task runs on that machine, it's going to use that template file you specify. I'm going to switch back here. The reason why that VM never got the task is because it's running on the Windows XP. Ideally, you should be capturing a Windows 7 image on a Windows 7 VM. So now we run this task on the correct machine. The Windows 7 computer should be seeing this fairly shortly. So the first thing, I jump back to the capture. So the first thing it's going to do is run through that sysprep task. That usually just takes a couple minutes. All right. So now that this is running, I'm going to jump back to the migration job. So that's the capture personality task. The next task we have is to tell it to boot into our automation. And again, if you use Pixie in your environment, you just select your Pixie disk here. The next task we have is to actually deploy the image. We're using Ghost for this. And so you select your image name. Unlike in DS6 where it was just files you'd point to, in DS7, remember it's creating packages for you. And so you're actually going to have a drop-down list of all your available images that you captured through this. Another common question we get is, if you already have an environment with 10 or 20 images, are you able to import those in here? And there is a tool that you can import images into it. It's called the Resource Import tool. And what this allows you to do is to choose an existing image. So you can point to a Ghost file or whatever you want, and you tell it the type of operating system, and it'll create that package for you. So you don't necessarily have to capture your image through DS7 to be able to deploy an image through it. So we're using our current product key. I didn't have to define one there. Some of these options you may not recognize if you have DS7 today because this is on the latest beta. So I kind of want to give you a sneak preview of what's may to come. Deploy anywhere is what's responsible for getting drivers into your image. Another common question we get is, what's better? Should I use deploy anywhere, or should I use a script, or should I use DISM? There's a few different ways of getting drivers into your image. Deploy anywhere is great as a built-in tool because it takes a per device or per driver approach. So what that means is it's going to analyze all your specific devices on that machine that you're imaging, and it's going to look in this database for each driver and then install the drivers based on specific devices. So an advantage of doing it that way is if you have, let's say, like an HP model, a fairly standard model that you already have all the drivers for, and then HP decides to change the mass storage drivers on you all of a sudden to see if you're paying attention, then all you'd have to do with deploy anywhere is just add that new mass storage driver in there, and then you're set because it's looking at all the devices individually. The other approach to injecting drivers is to take on a per model approach. And by a per model approach, what people typically do is you have a folder of the drivers for each specific model, and then you have a script that looks at that model name and basically injects all the drivers from that folder. The advantage of doing it that way is you can have basically approve or certify a specific model and have all the drivers in that one folder, and then if you ever need to change versions of a driver, you'd only be affecting that one model. So it really just depends on how many models you have and how you'd like to approach your driver injection process. So for here, we're having deploy anywhere turn on. It can also handle your HALs if you're doing Windows XP, where you need to take into consideration multi-processor, single processor HALs. And it can do mass storage drivers, network drivers, and in the latest DS version, even the generally available version, it can do other types of drivers too. So it can do video, audio, etc. This is our sysprep configuration. I would say in a lot of environments, you end up creating your own custom sysprep, and then you can use a script to kind of inject or make your own tokens and inject different values. So for instance, if you want a machine to join a certain OU in the Active Directory based on different criteria, you can easily script that into the file. Out of the box though, if you want to just do a very simple image, you can tell Altiris to generate a sysprep file for you based on data we already know about that machine. If it was a bare metal imaging, so if a machine that was unknown, then you can import a list of computer names, and it would add that name in there for you because that'd be considered part of the inventory. And then the credentials are used to join the machine to the domain, if that's part of your sysprep file. As part of the imaging process, we have some advanced features such as choosing your partitions, configuring the command lines for Ghost. An example of configuring the command line for Ghost is you can use Ghost to do what's called hot imaging. And I've actually done this before for Windows 7 migration, Hot imaging allows you to capture an image of the machine while it's running without the user even noticing. It can run silently, you can capture the image, you can store it to a network drive. It's great for doing a backup of the machine when you know you want to have the machine on so it's not completely shut off. So you can schedule it during lunchtime. A typical use case for that is for certain VIPs when you do their Windows 7 migration. You may want to do a full image backup first before you actually migrate them, just in case you miss anything. So what you could do is set up a hot image job to run during lunch while they're gone. You'll have a complete image capture. That way at night when they leave, let's say 5 o'clock, 6 o'clock, you schedule that migration job, you can have it kick off right away and you still have that backup image just in case. And it's called job security. File preservation is actually something that can be used for Windows 7 migrations. I don't have it set up in this demo, but what you can use it for is you can tell Ghost to image around a certain folder. So you can say, image this entire drive, but keep this one folder on there. So what you could do is, if you were doing like a PC transplant, capturing your personality, or if you're trying to back up certain files, you can store those files locally on that drive, and then using file preservation, image that drive, but still retain that folder. And then once the imaging is complete, you can restore that file or restore that personality using that folder that you retained through the imaging process. It's a pretty cool feature, and it's unique to Ghost. You cannot do that in RDeploy. The multicasting settings we kind of went over on a global scale, but if you want to customize that per imaging, you can. And then this just allows you to download the image from an HTTP location. These are all the options we have for actually deploying the image. Then once that image deploys and you boot back up into Windows, the next task you would run is to distribute that PC transplant personality, which basically restores that user data that you captured before the image. So here I'm using a token, just the computer name. So as I said earlier, if you're doing, like a computer name mapping, like an old name to a new name, you probably want to just use a command line for PC transplant. Command lines for all these tools are available through the user guides. So whether it's Ghost, PC transplant, deploy anywhere, you can do everything you can do through the GUI, but also through command line. So that gives you some scripting flexibility, and you can add some more logic as to how to map like the old name to the new name. If your package is password protected, you could enter the password there. So what we effectively get out of this migration job is, it backs up the user data based on the template you provide in Windows XP. It boots that Windows XP machine into either Pixie or into the local folder for WinPE. Then it runs Ghost to image the machine. The deploy anywhere checkbox is going to add your drivers automatically. That checkbox where we're using the built-in inventory to customize the sysprep. So that means Altiris is going to add your sysprep file in for you automatically. When that machine boots up, it's going to run through Windows sysprep process. At that point, it's still offline, so you can't run any tasks remotely while it's in sysprep. But then once sysprep finishes and it reboots again, the agent is going to come online and it's going to ask the server for what additional tasks you have. So at that point, that's when we restore the personality, and this is where you could add on, software tasks, right? So if you know that all of your machines need a certain piece of software, you would just add a new task and point it to your install job. So as I was saying, one of the big differences between DS6 and DS7 is that before you had two different systems of software packages, now we're just on one, so you can leverage all your packages that you already have and make them as part of your deployment process. So from here, we could just add a quick delivery and point it to any package we want. I'm going to go back over and see how our other machine is doing here. And you can see it is running the Ghost capture. You'll be able to see the progress, task by task, of exactly what's happening with it. So last question we had was about the image deployment. Is it a separate option to add to NS7.1? It's included as part of either Client Management Suite or Server Management Suite. One of the questions we had was how to reimage a Windows XP machine to Windows 7 but keep that same computer name. And that's what my process is using actually. So if we go back to my job here, I'll show you the part that does that for us. So if we go to our migration job, when we go to deploy the Windows 7 image, there's a checkbox in here that tells us how we're using the sysprep file. And so I'm keeping the same computer name because I'm telling Altiris to generate a sysprep file for us using inventory data. So it looks at that computer name that we already have as part of the inventory, the basic inventory, and it'll basically inject that into the sysprep file. And then when that machine is imaged, after Ghost finishes, it adds that sysprep file in there. So when sysprep runs, it pulls out the computer name and it's using the same name as before. And we'll see, yeah, Ghost is still running. So next time we may have, a follow-up webcast if you want to see some of the more advanced features that I talked about. But until then, I want to thank everyone for joining the migration from Windows XP to Windows 7 webcast. And if you have any questions about ITS or about consulting and how we can help you to get to Windows 7, feel free to give us a call or an email is provided through the email we'll be sending out later this week. So thank you everyone for joining and have a great week.